We're talking about pricing at a pricing conference, and now we're going to talk about people.
Yes.
And we thought we'd have a conversation between the two of us talking about how personas are relevant when you're having these conversations about pricing and packaging. It's great to see Patrick talk about this earlier as well. It turns out you kind of have to talk to the people you're selling software to understand them. And this is a way to kind of rationalize
Not always,
and do that. Not
for
always?
For the most part, yes.
Tell me more about that.
We'll talk about it when we talk about personas.
So how do you, when you arrive at a company and you talk about the personas that they're currently selling to, or if they haven't developed them, like how do you go about the origin story of bringing personas into a company and using them?
Yeah, I think first I'd have to admit that there are times when developing personas somehow take a backseat. Because when you're at a company, there's so much going on, there's so much to do, so prioritization, sometimes very ruthless, means that you deprioritize creating personas, and that comes back and bites you for sure. So that's a big lesson learned over the last few years for me as well, and I think with Zendesk as well, we're prioritizing creating our personas. And people typically think about personas, all right, I need to create a persona for a buyer or a user or whatever person that you're trying to target, but it's always good to take a step back and think about sort of like, what are the use cases that you're trying to solve for? Because you can quickly go into a deep end of just trying to understand this one person without really getting a context around what is that person really trying to solve for? Is my product a really good fit for that problem or not? So when you think about the use cases, it becomes really important to think about them beyond just verticalized use cases, because that's really easy. I sell into XYZ industry, and sort of like, that becomes very easy for me to say, all right, these are the three verticals we can target, and all we need to do is understand who are the personas within this. But I also think that, you can create a broader context by creating some sort of like patterns across behaviors in terms of the usage of the product, behaviors in terms of common values and beliefs. For example, if your company believes in delivering technology fast, if you're enabling your products, if your customers to deliver technology fast, they have to think the same way. They have to give up sort of like the complexity, the common beliefs that they've held for so long around sort of like, different development methodologies, different ways of delivering services to their customers. So if there's no match in terms of the values and beliefs, I think that's sort of like a no-starter. So you have to, in my opinion, first think about how do you find those pockets of your right customers. And from there, again, not really limiting yourself to thinking about, creating buyer personas only. I have this framework of BIU, which is buyer, influencer, and user, because it's really important to understand not only who you're selling to. In many companies, smaller companies, yes, this might be the same person who's doing a variety of different things, happens a lot. But as you go into sort of like, mid-sized companies or even larger enterprise companies, you tend to see there are multiple people who come into the decision-making process. So you have to broaden your persona research to get better prepared as a marketeer, as a salesperson, and of course sometimes as a CEO or the product person as well. So sort of like, taking a step back, not just jumping into developing, all right, who's the buyer? Let's just find everything about this person and build something nice and fancy on a piece of paper. That's my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, what the use cases are and the mapping between that and these personas. I think it's also interesting to think about, you've got product roadmap, you have these personas, and that maps into your packaging. I think it's interesting when Patrick showed some of the slides up here, something I want to point out is that if you have a pricing plan and you don't have a persona that's going to buy that pricing plan, you probably have a problem, right? So as you look to think about all the kinds of people you're servicing with your product, hopefully you've got a mapping internally to what the right plan is for them.
Yeah, I think again, pricing and packaging is something that you tend to look at a lot of dimensions. So persona is one of them, and that should definitely sort of like help you frame the right pricing and packaging strategy. But there are multiple things that go into it, including sort of like market forces that are out of your control, your competitive landscape, or just the financial modeling, whether this is a good price point for your company or your business or not. But to me, when the personas can come in really handy in this exercise when you've done a good job of understanding who these people really are. And typical personas and what we see generally sort of like in the marketing world as well, you try to understand what's their role, what's their title, what is their day look like, and that's about it. I think it's important to go a little deeper into even some of the emotional drivers, right? What makes this person successful in their day job? What is their growth look like? What would help them get to the next level? Is it a product or a technology that can help them do that? And then also getting a little bit of better understanding about their environment as well. And this goes back to the values and beliefs that I was talking about before. What else exists in their stack today that can tell you how are they thinking about purchasing technology? For example, I think there are two lenses that customers typically put on when thinking about technology. Some customers are focused primarily on TCO, which is around, well, how much is it really going to cost me to own this piece of technology, right? That tells you a lot about that customer in terms of their price sensitivity. And in a competitive market, that can be really difficult for a lot of companies, and you have to be creative in terms of bringing out the right pricing and packaging. But if customers are thinking about in terms of ROI, which is return on investment, that's a whole different kind of customer, because they're not that price sensitive. What they're looking for is value that'll help their company or their specific role and department scale and do better. So I think that brings in sort of like a good perspective when you're digging into the persona. So these questions are important. And sometimes people sort of like ask, why do you need to know what else is in their stack? This is exactly the reason why you need to know. Because the choices that they've made in the past will tell you a lot about the choices they'll make in the future and whether your product is going to be a good fit or not. The other question that you can ask, and this is an interesting one, is around which technologies did they end up swapping in the last few years? And again, the reasons behind them. And if price was one of them, packaging is one of them, you can learn a lot from those questions as well. So these are sort of like questions that go beyond the normal persona questions and interview questions that most people use, but can be especially useful for pricing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's really smart to think about, for each persona, what are you helping them achieve? Which is a little different than just what does the product do.
Right.
So these personas hopefully have a particular goal. Maybe it's in their career trajectory if you're targeting a specific kind of buyer. How do you track that stuff? How do you build that richness into the profiles?
Well, I think there's also a realization that perfection is not sometimes attainable in terms of building personas up front. Again, it goes back to prioritization, the resources you have at hand and the time you have. Some tough choices have to be made. But I would say start somewhere and make it a priority to keep it up to date and refine those personas over a period of time. And while there's a ton of importance that we place in personas, I think there are a lot of other things that can complement the persona research and that can help you enrich that research. And things like win-loss analysis, churn analysis. So try to drive a mix of these things and just don't rely on personas, because you will see that as you're gaining customers, you'll learn about their patterns more from just picking up a conversation or running a survey, and actions speak louder than words. So some of the things that you see in the churn analysis or win-loss analysis will probably tell you more and unique things about their buying behaviors and things like that. I'll give you an example of a company as well where I should remain nameless because I can't just get into a lot of details, where we ran a survey to sort of like test multiple prices, like at what point customers would be comfortable with this new product that we were introducing. And of course, on paper, people kind of like chose either the top priced sort of like line item because they thought the product provided a ton of value, and we were advertising also in the survey like what you would get as a part of this product, how it was unique in its value proposition, and things like that. So of course, on paper we got like on the 5-point scale, most of the people voted on the 4 or the 5. But in reality, like when we actually introduced the product, we saw that we struggled with the sales. So that says a lot about what people would tell you on the phone versus what they would do, and that's why I continue to emphasize the fact that complement your persona research with certain other things that are really tied to direct impact on the business that you can learn from, and also the customer's past behaviors and interaction choices that they've made, and I think that'll tell you a lot more.
I think about that a lot. The data that you gather from folks, if you're kind of relating it back to a particular persona, there's the conversation you might have had with a prospect, which to your point might be a little bit colored by the fact that they're not yet a customer. But customer emails and customer support conversations are another way to really richly add some context to these things, because you're finding out during the deals process that they're harder to sell to, or this price point is specifically difficult. Another thing you can find out is that the unit is wrong. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but there are ways to price products where you might charge for access to the platform. You might charge by user. There might be some other thing, whether it's a dyno, whether it's a repository, and that number might be wrong, right? You might have the wrong mismatched thing. Sometimes people want to see consistency of price, and if you're pricing by product, that's going to be a different experience than if it's by using a resource or something like that.
Right. No, I completely agree. Yeah.
I wonder, how do we keep these updated? If we've done a good job, if companies really kind of take away from this and they go out and create their first personas, how do they kind of test those and make sure that they're still accurate, a year from now?
I think there are certain things that naturally happen in the business that are good sort of like milestones for you to think about updating your personas. This could be introducing a new product line. This could be sort of like introducing some new packaging and things like that. And then things that might happen in the market. Maybe there are like new competitors and you're seeing more pressure on the business and it's time to reevaluate whether you're selling to the right people, how you're positioning yourself to them, and like what is now important to them. Price sensitivity might not have been a thing before, but now that there are 4 other people who are great imitators and offering something that kind of sort of looks like yours, might create a different dynamic with the customers. So I think there are a lot of things that that can sort of like be the triggers or milestones for you to consider when thinking about updating and maintaining personas. The other thing that you can also do, and again, talking about just broadening your scope in terms of like understanding your customers, just sheer customer data analysis, right? Understanding when and why and how your customers are either using different products, are upgrading to new editions and things like that. If you learn certain patterns, and we've learned over a period of time in different companies as well. In my current company, we have some trends around, we see and understand, and we also have a critical mass of customers, so it's easy for me to say. I understand that that is not a luxury for a lot of new startups, but for us, it's easy to go back and look into our data and identify sort of like certain things that our personas somehow embrace, or they behave in a certain way during the course of their journey with us, that become great opportunities for us marketeers to leverage. But it doesn't sort of like come easy. You have to be very deliberate about that research and deliberate about the analysis that you have to do about your customer's life cycle and journey with you.
I think it's another lens also that companies can use to look at the metrics of the business, right? So I think personas, oftentimes we might have a company that has 3 plans, and if you're calculating churn by plan, maybe you have some actionable insights there. Another way to consider this is to look at, your personas and which plan are they buying, and if they're not upgrading or they are, what's driving that? Right? I think there's a really interesting mapping between product features, these personas, to your point about these use cases.
Yeah. I think there's another thing actually I'd like to add there, that people generally focus on creating personas that'll buy your solution. Try creating one for the person that doesn't buy your solution. And I say that because this kind of becomes your negative persona. And this is especially helpful, if not for anybody else, your sales teams, because a lot of times in the sales cycle, some companies and buyers might kind of sort of look the same. And it's important for them to differentiate sort of like, where they will definitely fall into the same traps that you've seen over a period of time and the patterns you've recognized because you're close to your customers, and how you can educate the rest of the company. So when you think about creating your BIU model, make sure that you have like some persona that is a negative persona, that do not waste your time on this. It's been tried and tested. You're not special. You're not going to nail it, right? So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it helps you define the boundaries, right, of where you're trying to sell into and what who you don't want as customers.
Right.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks so much. This has been super fun.
Thank you.